All right, and we are recording. So, Professor Jeremi Suri, thank you so much for taking the time to connect today.
My pleasure to talk with you, Jake.
I appreciate it. And for those who don't know, Professor Jeremi Suri is a historian and the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And Jeremy has also written Civil War by Other Means that came out a couple years ago. And before that, the book, The Impossible Presidency. And Jeremy also hosts a podcast called This is Democracy. Did I get that all right? Am I missing anything?
No, well, I mean, there's more you could mention, but that's plenty. That's fine. Thank you. You're very kind, Jake.
Yeah. And so Jeremy, tell us a bit about your background, how you became a professor at UT, and what drives you, and what has formed some of your current ideology and understanding of the world that's led you to write these books and to teach at UT. So help us understand your upbringing and background of it.
Great question. So I'm the child of immigrants to the United States. My father came in 1965 as an immigrant from India. When he came to New York in 1965 as a college student from India, he was one of the first generations of Indians who could actually come to the U.S. because until that time, our immigration laws, which went back to 1924, had made it very hard for people from South Asia to come to the U.S. My father arrived in 1965. No one knew what Indian food was in the U.S. He was really, coming from a background that was unfamiliar. My mother is the child of immigrants who came from Russia and Lithuania fleeing pogroms against Jews. So I'm half Jewish and half Hindu. I'm a Hindu. There are a few of us in the world. And I say all that to explain my interest in history because as long as I can remember, Jake, I was always interested in history, even as a little kid, because I wanted to explain my family. How did this happen, right? How did India and Russia come together in New York City? I grew up in a pretty modest working class family of immigrants in New York City. I went to public schools. I was fortunate to go to a magnet school, Stuyvesant High School, which I think opened my eyes to the world of learning and the world of advanced academics. I was fortunate to get a scholarship to go to Stanford, which is where I did my undergraduate work. And I had some mentors there who were historians. Actually, they were in classes I was required to take. I thought I was going to become a lawyer. I always had this love of history, but I didn't know you could make that a profession. And I had some mentors, and I think it's true for all of us, right? Mentors change your life. And I went on then to get my PhD at Yale. And for 10 years, I taught at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which was wonderful. And we could have stayed there forever. But then we moved down to Austin when we had the opportunity to come here because we thought there's one place that's cooler than Madison. It would probably be Austin. And why do I teach the stuff I teach and write about what I write about? Well, because for me, understanding the changes of the last century and a half explain not only my life, but they explain our democracy. Our democracy is not really about the Constitution. The Constitution matters, of course, but it's about the different contributions different groups have made to our democracy. And if we want our democracy to remain vibrant and healthy and sustainable, we have to understand that past and learn lessons from that past, from the good and the bad, moving forward. And that's what motivates me. I know the United States was a savior for my family. My father and my mother's family would not have survived without the United States, but I also know the United States as a democracy has to keep evolving. So we study the past to learn how we can evolve in the future better.
And how did your upbringing, half Jewish and half Indian, how do you think that influenced you?
I have a natural inclination toward cosmopolitanism, toward people who are worldly, and that's not being elitist, by the way. There are lots of people who are worldly who are not elites because they come from families, right, that are all over the world. Mexican immigrants are often quite worldly. And so I have a natural inclination and an interest in the mixing of cultures. I am suspicious of purity. I'm suspicious of anyone who says that there's one clear answer or one way of being. I think the genius of the human experience is the mixing of different things.
And you also mentioned that in saying that as history explains our democracy, a big part of what matters is the contributions that different groups have made to our country over time, right?
Absolutely right. I mean, people often ask me, especially when I travel internationally to lecture and stuff, what's the American secret sauce? And you just said what it is, Jake. It's the attraction of talent from different backgrounds, and every generation remakes our economy, remakes our society, and it remakes it with ideas that came from outside the U.S. in a now U.S. framework.
And looking at today, I mean, let's talk about the current landscape for a moment. I mean, a day or two ago, Iran launched an attack at Israel. We have a war in between Russia and Ukraine. It seems like there's a lot of chaos. What do you make of all this? Specifically, how do you view all of this in context with your vision as a historian?
It's a great question. I think we're at a crossroad in the Middle East as we are within the United States. We have political entities that no longer match up with the reality of people's experiences. Most people live worlds and lives that are more mixed. They're connecting to people in different parts of the world. And our state structures, the Iranian state, the Israeli state, they don't match that lived experience. We need to reinvent our political institutions to reflect who we are. Right now, our institutions are defining us rather than us defining them. Let me be very clear about this. Most Israelis I know have a much more cosmopolitan outlook than the Israeli government. They are much more open to different communities. And most Arabs that I know, most Muslims that I know, are much more open to Jews and other non-Muslims. So what we have are states that are encouraging extremism. And we need to change the structures of our states. I'd say the same thing about the United States. We are less divided than our politics are. 70 to 80% of Americans agree on many, many issues, whether Democrat or Republican, but our state structures are dividing us. Instead of the states defining us, we need to define our states.
So what does it mean exactly? Like the people in the countries generally agree with each other, but when you say the politics disagree, like what does that mean exactly?
It means that extreme voices have captured our institutions. So in Israel, for example, the coalition government that Benjamin Netanyahu leads, as of this conversation now, who knows what it'll look like in the future, right, does not represent anywhere near a majority viewpoint. It's a collection of small parties, each of which has a small following and an extreme voice that's not representative. Now, I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying they're not representative. The same is true within the United States. I think we all agree, regardless of where we stand, that the candidates we see in the Democratic and Republican Party today don't reflect our society. First of all, they're much older than our society, right? Look at what they look like. Most of what they stand for represents party positions that are oversimplifications and distortions of what most of us believe. And we can't continue to let the political structures define us. What makes every generation of democracy vibrant, as a historian, I would say, is that we reform our institutions. We need to change our governments to be more reflective of who we are.
So what needs to happen? Because we already have a democracy, right? Here we have a democracy in
Yeah.
Israel, there's a democracy. So what would need to change to have the government be more reflective of the desires of the people?
Yeah, so the first point is correct. The United States is, of course, a democracy. Israel is, of course, a democracy. For all of their flaws, these countries are democracies. But my first point is that democracy, the historian says, it's not, there's never one kind of democracy. It's always evolving, and it has to adjust. And that's what makes democracy a resilient and effective form of governance. It's not brittle. It changes and adapts. And what does that look like today? Well, for example, we need ways to bring in more young voices. If you look at our economies in the US and Israel and other vibrant economies are driven by innovators, many of whom are, maybe your age, Jake. And those are not the voices that are most prominent. Because, why is that? Well, because in our democracies now, those who have more time and more money get more say. And even if you're very successful at your age, Jake, you've got young children, you've got college tuition to pay, you've got all these things, so you don't get as involved in using your money to influence people as those who might be at a different stage in their lives. Young people vote less in our societies because we make it hard for them to vote, right? In the United States, you need to register to vote and all these things. So one of the things we can do is make it easier for young people to participate. A second thing we could do, certainly in the United States, is make it so everything is not winner take all. You know, if in this election in November, if in one of the states, Joe Biden comes out 1 percentage point ahead of Trump, Biden gets all the electoral votes in that state. That creates a winner-take-all situation, right? You could have a situation where the electoral votes are split. That would give small parties a chance. That would give different voices a chance. These are all examples of a long list of things we could do.
But in all these examples, who do you think is being underrepresented? You mentioned young people. Would you say so? Is this solution that once this younger generation gets older, that's the solution, that the younger generation as a whole have good views, or what is?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure. But I do think in many of the democracies of the world today, an older generation, and to put it oversimplified, an older white generation is more represented. And
And
that's,
that's the crux of some of these problems we're seeing.
I think so. I think what we end up debating are issues that are actually not the issues that really matter to most people. Think how little we talk about economic opportunity for young people. Think how little we talk about clean public spaces for people. Think how little we talk about actually improving education. People argue
Yeah,
about it, but not about actually improving it and making it accessible to everyone. So yeah, the
right.
issues we're talking about are the wrong issues.
But earlier you were saying that a core problem is that the way that the government, and correct me if I'm
Mhm.
misrepresenting what you said, but that the way that the government is structured doesn't best represent the will of the people.
Correct.
So, but how does the younger generation, them getting older and participating more, how does that change the fundamental problem of government structure?
Well, because what needs to happen and what's happened in our best moments of democratic dynamism in the US and in Europe and in Israel and elsewhere is in those moments when a new generation comes in, they change the structure of government to help themselves and help those who come after them. Let me give you one example of this. One of the most important reforms that was made in the early 20th century was when, in a number of states in the US, women started to vote, and then you had women's suffrage in the United States with the 19th Amendment in 1920. You were fundamentally changing the structure, so now women could participate in the voting process. The 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act provide new protections for minority groups to vote. A new generation had already started to vote, or a new group had already started to vote, but they didn't just vote and keep the system the way it was. They changed the system for those who came after them. So the civil rights movement was perhaps led by older civil rights activists, but by changing the system, younger civil rights activists were now able to participate.
What would be ideal if younger people could? What would be an ideal change for the next generation to implement in government?
I would love to see a scenario where instead of you're having to register to vote and you're having to go through all the hoops, that actually you were required to vote in the same way you're required to fill out a tax return. That would mean that government had to make it easier for you to vote. You could still go and vote none of the above. You have every right to do that. But that you would actually vote and government had to make it easier for you to vote. I think that would bring in so many more younger voices, and it would widen the spectrum of real discussion in our society.
Why don't we do that? It seems like a good, obvious idea, you know.
Because there are a lot of people who don't want young people to vote.
Hmm. And older people are going to go to the polls regardless, is the idea.
Exactly. Exactly. The group that turns out the most are those above 60.
Huh. So if we make it easier for younger people to vote, and then and so what are some other changes you would hope that younger people would enact, or what do you hope the government looks like in 50 years from now?
Yeah, I
What's
think,
different about the US government
and
then?
I'm confident it will, because the
Yeah.
historian in me says that new generations do change the agenda, and we'll have new problems in 50 years. It's not going to be nirvana. But I do think, for example, everyone in the United States should have access to health insurance. Uh, and why? Because especially for a younger generation, my students, they tend to, many cases, be self-employed, right? They work running their own small tech company or whatever it is, and it's financially prohibitive, even if you're a very successful small company, to buy insurance. And I know a lot of people who stay in a job they hate because they need insurance, especially for their kids. Think how much more mobile you'd be if you had health insurance guaranteed. I still think you should have to pay into it, but I think insurance. I think another thing that we need in our society is we need much better attention to protecting the environment. It's crazy that there are people in our society who don't have clean water in parts of our country, clean air. I think that's something the young generation certainly believes, and I think openness to people marrying whoever they want to marry. There are a number of these issues. But I think to make it clear, I'm not just making an argument for the left. I also think young people are concerned about debt and don't like the idea that we run up a big federal deficit. And I think that's something that's going to change. Also, tax fairness. There are a whole bunch of issues that are not necessarily left or right. Where this is a big point in my scholarship, Jake, where we're doing what we've always done because it's a legacy and because we can't figure out what to do differently. And so we're accepting suboptimal outcomes. A new generation doesn't do that any longer. It says they're going to push the boundaries and try new things.
Got it. So hopefully some of those changes happen, or at least
So.
given the opportunity to happen.
Yeah, me too. I hope so.
So a couple of years ago, you wrote the book Civil War by Other Means. That brought you into the limelight a bit on some popular podcasts. And I think your book got great recognition and a lot of great reviews. For those who haven't read it, I mean, how would you describe the book? What are some of the most compelling or you think unique arguments that the book makes that you want people to know about?
Thank you for asking that question. So I wrote this book when I had finished the prior book. As everyone knows, one project leads to the next. I was struck by how leaders, presidents, and others were stuck sometimes because of past historical experiences that they couldn't get over, traumas from the past. The argument of the book is that the Civil War is still with us because there's unfinished business. We're not fighting another Civil War now, I don't believe. I think it's actually silly to say we're going to have another Civil War. But there's a legacy from that prior Civil War. There's skeletons in the closet that haven't been addressed. And I point to these both as institutions and as attitudes. So some of the institutions that we've inherited are institutions of inequality in our society, institutions of voter suppression. We've already talked about some of that. Things that were put in place after the Civil War to make it harder for the former 4 million enslaved people who now became citizens to be full participants in our society. And we've inherited those. We don't always see them because sometimes they're not used to exclude people, but other times they are used. And same with attitudes. And I don't just mean racism. I mean attitudes that come out of the Civil War that justify groups of people holding on to power in the interest of states' rights, which is really a cover for keeping power for my people and not allowing other people to have power within my society. Those are attitudes as well as institutions that carry on. We need to, I believe, address them, see them as diseases in our system, and finally work to change them.
Do you think that these remnants from the Civil War, like you mentioned, voter suppression, inequality, certain attitudes and institutions, were these intended to be hidden and subliminal and covert, or is it like, in other words, a lot of these ideas like voter suppression doesn't seem to be an explicit conspicuous thing in society. It seems like you have to figure out where it is. Is that intentional?
Well, it's both. A lot of this was done in plain sight to intimidate people. And I want to say before I continue that everything in this book is out of optimism because I believe our country is a great democracy and can be even greater. There's no better democracy than ours, and we can get better. But as great a democracy as we were, for example, coming out of the Civil War, lynching is quite common in the United States, where vigilante groups with their own weapons, often with the help of local law enforcement, go and attack people who have violated the rules, not the law, violated the rules. This would be a black man who wants to have a relationship with a white woman, or a Jewish man who wants to open a business and challenge Christian businesses in their community. These lynchings were public beatings and public killings that were used to intimidate others. That kind of violence continued in the US until the 1960s. It was explicit. After the 1960s, it becomes less explicit, but there's still elements of that bullying going on in our society. Those attitudes still carry on. We need to be more explicit about addressing that. It's one of the reasons I worry about so many people owning weapons. I know this is going to cause controversy when I say this. I'm not against gun ownership, but I am very concerned about the number of Americans who own so many firearms. And I wonder what that is. Is that just about showing you're a man by having a gun, or is it trying to intimidate people? And so that's my concern. That was, some of these things were very explicit. And then over time, they become, as you say, more hidden, more subtle. Same with voter suppression. It used to be in many states, including some northern states, you had to take a test at the polls to prove that you could vote. And it's so interesting, right? You can look up some of these. I cite some of them in my book. These poll tests were designed to make it hard for certain groups to vote. Now you can't have a poll test, but we have all kinds of other things. Like in Florida, if you owe money from your prison sentence to the state, you can't vote. But you can vote if you're a real estate developer and you owe money to the bank, right? We do all kinds of things to make it harder for people to vote. It's now subtle, but it comes from this more open experience after the Civil War.
So a lot of these things were transferred from the Civil War in an attempt to keep us unequal, or what? Like, why did these how did these aspects carry into today's society, and why?
Well, because first of all, to be empathetic to those who supported these things, it was a major transition. It's hard for us to imagine 4 million human beings going from being people of no rights to now having, at least in theory, equal rights with you. And take President Andrew Johnson, who I talk about in the book. I think he's the worst president we ever had. President Andrew Johnson was a poor white tailor from Tennessee, and he hated the rich white plantation owners, but he was afraid of the free former slaves, because those free former slaves would be able to put him out of business because they might be better tailors. They would compete with him, and he thought they would work for less money. And so there was fear of these changes. And one of our biggest failures after the Civil War, Jake, was that we allowed those fears to hijack policies in the South. Why was Andrew Johnson one of our worst presidents? Because he didn't enforce the law. He allowed, even though there were 3 amendments of the Constitution, the 14th in particular, that should have guaranteed equality, he refused to enforce that, and he pardoned most of the Confederates who were responsible for crimes and other kinds of violence. I talk about this in my book, and they were able to come back into power. And so when the losers came back into power, they used the power to actually try to protect their agenda, even though they had lost the war.
Wow. And one thing I've heard you say before on a podcast is that even though people in this viewpoints, it's not always the case that like one group is right, the other is wrong. That
Correct.
we need to have a space where we can encourage and respect the differences in other views. So I want to ask about that. Like, how does that work when two groups have radically different views? Is there a time where someone's objectively right, someone's objectively wrong, or do you think there's just a lot of virtue to be said for us both having our different viewpoints?
It's a great question. I think we have to recognize that we can always be wrong. Anyone who's so certain that they have things right is not thinking about the range of complexity in the world. But what we have to begin with is a fact basis. And so where you are wrong is if you are making up facts where we do know there are facts. So you cannot say, I think legitimately, that Joe Biden did not win the last election. I know that might anger some people when I say that. The evidence is overwhelming that he did win the last election. Now, you can say you don't like Joe Biden as a president. You can say you like someone else, and I can like someone different from you, and I can be wrong. But we have to begin with a factual basis. How do we know what a fact is? A fact is something, and this is what we try to do as historians, that we can prove, that has real evidence behind it.
What does it mean, prove? Lots of stuff has evidence. What is there a threshold for evidence?
I think the threshold for evidence is that it's not something that's written with the intention of making a position. It actually tells you about the reality that someone is in. So when I write a letter of recommendation for a student, I do like many of these a week, that's not a fact. What I'm saying in there, I'm writing to help that student. But when I have an exam a student has submitted to me and I grade that exam, you can argue over the grade with me, but that exam is a fact. I have that piece of evidence in front of me. I have that exam, right? It's like I can have the ballots from voting, right? In Georgia, they counted every single ballot, right? And so we know what the outcome was, right? So a piece of evidence is not an advocacy position. It's something that represents the reality of its time in a credible way, not simply to support a position. And so I believe that we should encourage the broadest range of opinions, but make sure they are fact-based. What are we teaching people as students? We're teaching them to identify facts and then build their own opinions. And I'll tell you something very honest and personal. I'm always skeptical if I'm in a room where everyone agrees. So long as we're talking about facts, there should be disagreement. That's good. That's how a democracy should work.
What do you do then when such a large group of people have a viewpoint that is not fact-based? Like
Yes.
the idea that half or a third of the country thinks that Trump did win the last election
Yeah, it's a problem.
in spite of facts. I mean, how do we reconcile that with the idea that we should respect each other's viewpoints?
Well, so I respect someone who adopts a position different from mine on whatever the policy matter is. They have a right to that. I don't respect someone who doesn't seek a fact basis for what they're trying to do. And we need to educate people to be fact based. So I'm not ever trying to educate someone to not support the person or the position that they support, but I'm educating them, I hope, to make their position fact based. So I respect a lot of Republicans I disagree on policy with because they're making fact-based arguments. I'm not a Mitch McConnell fan, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, but I think he generally tries to make fact-based arguments. I think he's doing that, and I can respect that. I have a lot of respect for Mitt Romney, Senator Mitt Romney from Utah. So that's okay to be fact-based, and we want to encourage that difference. Those I don't have respect for, and those include people on the left, are those who think that they're right because it's about your identity or about how vociferous you are in making your point. That's not fair argumentation. And so our role as educators is to differentiate these things. And I think then we can come to some agreement and compromise. I mean, you and I can agree on the facts, and we can disagree, for example, over whether we think abortion should be legal or not legal. And we can look at the facts, and we can have, I think, very legitimate different points of view. And then it's the role of policy to try to find compromise, to try to find spaces to bring together people with factually different points of view.
So ideological or philosophical arguments are good as long as they're both based on fact.
Correct.
And if someone's views are not rooted in fact, then they should be, and then they're worth debating.
Correct. That's exactly my position. Yeah. And I, by the way, and I think that my fact-based opinions can be wrong. I've changed my opinions over time, and I probably will continue to change them. And I hope I always will. If the day I stop changing my opinions is the day I stop thinking.
Yeah. So it's interesting how like the same facts can take us different directions.
Yeah.
So the world is in a bit of a crisis with the different wars going on, and you've advised leaders and policymakers. What do you think is one of the misconceptions that people have about making decisions in times of crisis? What do you think are like, how do people reason through and manage risk and think about whether, to go to war or to avoid it? And
Great question. And I've written a bit about this, particularly in the book, The Impossible Presidency. I think there's a way in which people kind of glorify crises. Like we glorify Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? We think in crises, the real people stand up and they make these extraordinary decisions. And then some people like Bill Clinton argued that a crisis allows you to do things you couldn't do otherwise. It opens up space for change. I think just the opposite is true. What tends to happen in crises moments like the one we're in now is that people become risk averse. They choose the safest route, and they don't think in new ways. They go back to the thinking that they always have had. There's a whole area of scholarship called the operational code that says that when you're in a crisis, when you feel threatened, you do what worked in the last crisis. You just repeat that. Right. So the last time the bear came after me, I ran as fast as I could. So this time I'm going to run as fast as I can, even though now it's a wolf that's faster than me. Right. So we're not creative in crises. I think we have to do a better job of avoiding crises. We've become too comfortable to be in a crisis moment. And how do we avoid crises? We need to be more proactive, especially with diplomacy, especially with negotiation, before we get to these moments. It is terrible that for the last 5 to 10 years, including the presidencies of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, the United States did not encourage more negotiation between Israel and its neighbors. We discouraged it often. And that made this crisis moment more likely to happen.
Even in spite of the Abraham Accords?
Well, the Abraham Accords were between Israel and a number of smaller countries, the UAE and others, but not the core countries that are in the dispute, right? Which would involve Iran, the Palestinian territory, Syria. Though that's where we dropped the ball.
And so what you're saying is that people need to be more creative during crisis situations to adapt to the crisis at hand and not reason through analogy of what they did in the last situation.
Precisely. And take more action to avoid crises before they happen.
Yeah. But once we're in it, what do you do? How do you?
Once we're in it, we have to be very, and this is what I have advised policymakers. It's very hard. We have to make sure that we are not responding instinctively in the way that we've taught ourselves, or maybe even are biologically programmed to respond, that we're thinking through the issues. We have to slow down. And that's exactly what I hope the Israeli government will do in response to the terrible Iranian attack on Israel, right? I'm not saying Israel shouldn't respond. I think maybe they should, but they need to think through that response. Simply punching back as hard as you can might make things worse for you as well as for your adversary.
And who today do you think does embody these qualities? You know, you're describing the way that a leader should respond in crisis. Is there anyone today that does that
Yeah,
effectively?
I think there are some. I think that at different levels we see this. I think there were a number of governors during the COVID crisis, which we all lived through, who responded pretty well. It doesn't mean they were flawless. Everyone made mistakes. You're going to make mistakes in a crisis. I think of Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, a Republican from Maryland, who found a way to, on his own, purchase equipment, masks and things for his population in the state when the federal government couldn't get it to him. He was creative, right? He found ways to get resources to his people. I'm going to praise the Republican governor of Texas, of my state. He's usually not someone I'm a fan of, but early on in the crisis, he was able to get information out, and he closed certain businesses and things. It was costly for the economy, but I think it kept us safer in some parts of the state. And so I think we saw some good leadership during the COVID crisis. I think what happened was, as the crisis went on, it became politicized. And then we didn't see the same quality of leadership. But early on, I think we actually, if you move people outside of the politics in the immediacy of it, they did pretty well. Another person I'll mention, even though she made some mistakes, is the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. She was a leader of Germany for 20 years. She grew up in East Germany, left East Germany when the wall came down, when the Cold War ended in 1989 or so, and then became a leader of the Conservative Party in Germany. And over the course of 20 years, one of the things that she was very clear about is that Germans had to understand their responsibility to Europe and to the world, that the Holocaust still mattered, that Germany had to be involved with building a stronger Europe, a stronger alliance with the United States. She had a close relationship with George W. Bush and with Barack Obama. She made mistakes in not taking stronger action against Vladimir Putin, but she made Germany into an anchor of peace and now a supporter of Ukraine and others in Europe after she left office. So I think she's an example of a very effective leader that we can look to as a model.
And what do you think was the right or is the right approach towards Russia? I mean, you might have heard John Mearsheimer and others say that it's the U.S.'s fault and that Russia gave every indication that this was a red line for them involving Ukraine and NATO, and that we should have known. How do we made certain movements with Ukraine that Russia necessarily would attack, and therefore the U.S. is in fact the aggressor? What do you make of that argument?
So John Mearsheimer in particular is a friend. I know him. I have a high regard for his scholarship, and I like him as a person. But I just think he's dead wrong on this. But he's making arguments from fact. So back to our earlier discussion. It's a legitimate debate, right? John Mearsheimer is as fact-based as anyone I know. And so he's looked at the facts and he's come to that interpretation. I see it radically differently from the same facts. Here's how I look at it, that the people of Ukraine have lived under the Russian and German boot for a century. Stalin killed 30 million Ukrainians. Hitler murdered millions of Ukrainians. And many of them Jews, many of them not Jews. And if I were a Ukrainian and we had independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I would definitely want Western American support. And that's a legitimate claim. Why should they not be able to defend themselves? Why don't they have the right to defend themselves as Russians and Germans and others defend themselves? And Putin's response to that is, well, they're not a real people. Well, he doesn't get to make that decision, right? He doesn't get to make that decision. I think they have a right of self-defense, and their desire to be part of NATO made total sense from their point of view. And if NATO is to be an alliance of democracies, and they as a democracy wanted to be part of NATO, it was something we should have considered. I think we could have still managed it better, but I don't think you can blame the United States or blame the Ukrainians for wanting to protect a people and their independence.
Is NATO an alliance of democracies, or is it not explicitly an alliance against Russia?
Well, so the quip on NATO in the 1950s when it was created was that it was created for three reasons, right? To keep the Russians out, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Americans in. Russians out, Germans down, Americans in. And to some extent, that's still true. It is an alliance designed to protect what we hope and think are mostly democracies in Europe from Russian aggression. It's designed to protect those democracies from German aggression by making sure that Germany doesn't have a strong, independent military, and to keep the United States in as an economic and military protector. And I think that's reasonable. I think that's realistic, knowing the history of this region. You don't want Germany to have to build a huge military again to defend itself, and you don't want to expose these countries to what is a long history of Russian aggression. I mean, Putin has shown us that Russia will do this. So I think it's a defensive alliance. It's not perfect, but it is a legitimate and generally non-aggressive alliance that protects democracies.
There's the argument that like NATO has this implicit circular reasoning embedded within it, because by creating this alliance, you're therefore making Russia feel defensive and have to be an aggressor to say, wow, there's all these countries that are explicitly against me. And there's this thought that had we invited Russia into NATO, or had we dispelled NATO after the Cold War, that Russia wouldn't have been as aggressive. What do you make of that? The idea that like by setting up this NATO arm, you're creating these two sides.
Yeah, well, there is something to that, I think. I think there's a fact basis to that argument. And there are even some who have said that the United States tricked the Soviet Union, that Gorbachev believed that NATO would not be expanded, at least, and then we did expand NATO. So I think those are legitimate points of view. I also think that if you look at the facts, NATO did many things to reach out to Russia. We created the Partnership for Peace, for example. And NATO's posture before the attack on Ukraine was a posture of much more defense. NATO was not in a position to attack Russia. So yes, Russia can feel left out, and I see that. And you're balancing that with the interests that Poland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, and others have in defending themselves. So there is a trade-off there. But it's not fair to say that NATO threatened Russia. It didn't. Its posture was defensive. And even now, it's not really prepared to attack Russia in any way. But maybe more could have been done. Yes, I mean, the effort was to make Russia feel like NATO was a friendly alliance, to connect Russia economically. And I think it is a fair criticism to say that in retrospect, we should have done more in those dimensions.
You said you respect John Mearsheimer's view because it's based in fact. Are there any facts that you and John Mearsheimer disagree on?
I think, yes, I think we would disagree in our emphasis on the Ukrainian people being a people who have a right to defend themselves. I think John sees the world in terms of great powers. And in seeing the world in terms of great powers, he thinks that in kind of Thucydides fashion, right, this is what Thucydides says in his great work on the Peloponnesian War, that the big powers do what they must, and the small powers, the small people accept it. They have no choice. He sees the world that way, and there's a fact pattern to that. But I don't see the 20th century that way. I see the 20th century as a century of smaller peoples rising up, former parts of empires and others. And so it's not a disagreement on what the facts are, but it's a disagreement on how much emphasis you give to Ukrainian identity and who the Ukrainians are.
Do you believe that John Mearsheimer's belief that U.S. and a few other NATO countries lied to Russia and misled Russia historically?
I don't think that's right. Actually, there I
No.
would dispute the facts to him a little bit because I've looked at the policy, as has he, and I think what you've had are shifting policies and uncertainty. So Bill Clinton, when he becomes president, doesn't know what he's going to do about NATO. So he didn't lie to Boris Yeltsin, the then Russian leader. He wasn't sure, right? So what you have is American uncertainty. You might even have Americans changing positions, but that's different from lying. Lying is Vladimir Putin now saying that there are Nazis in Ukraine, or when there is an attack in Russia, a terrorist attack in Russia that he knows was not caused by Ukraine, blaming the Ukrainians for organizing it. That's lying. What you have with the United States is mixed signals, and you could blame us for giving mixed signals, but I have not seen evidence that any president on that issue explicitly told Russia something that they knew was not true.
Got it. And that's the point that you and John Mearsheimer disagree on. So looking back at like these wars and even before that, 500 years ago, even, who's one historical figure that you think has been misunderstood and that?
There are a lot of them,
No.
actually. I'll give a couple, one positive and one negative, just to get us started, right? So my new book on Civil War by Other Means talks about Ulysses Grant a lot. And for a long time, people viewed Ulysses Grant as a failed president because he had a lot of corruption around him, as a drunk because he did drink too much. And it was part of a story of the failure of the Union and the failure of what happened after the Civil War. Well, in doing my research, I found, and a few other historians have found this recently, it's kind of a changing view of Grant. Grant comes across to me now as a hero. When he was president, Grant would read letters from white people, black people, and others in the South who were suffering, and he would try to help them. In fact, he did this so much that his Secretary of State tried to keep the letters away from him. Grant also worked with Congress to pass some of the most important laws that were used to protect our democracy. One of them is the 1871 Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act, which he uses to then, through judicial means and military means, to basically break up the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan comes back then a few decades later. That law is now used to prosecute the 1,000+ people who have been prosecuted for breaking into the Capitol on January 6th. So I think Grant was actually a pretty extraordinary president. He turned out to be a great writer. He wrote the best memoir of any president. So he's an unsung, I think, hero in our history. And I think there's a lot we can learn from Grant. Grant began the Civil War believing African Americans were inferior, believing Jews were inferior. Some of the first areas he occupies, he prohibits Jews from having control of those areas. But over the course of the war, his views changed as he sees how African Americans fight. 200,000 former slaves fought in the Union Army. He sees Jewish contributions. His views change. He adjusts over time. I respect that so much. So that's my positive. My negative is, I think, in the United States in particular, even though he was a very, very good leader, I think there's a kind of cult of worship of Winston Churchill that's really dangerous. Because the cult of worship of Winston Churchill is this eloquent man who's tough and fights in all circumstances. And I think it encourages an over-militarization of policy, right? If you want to be Churchillian, right, you're supposed to be tough and punch hard under all circumstances. You know, I don't want Israel to be Churchillian in dealing with Iran. I want Israel to negotiate. I want diplomacy. So I think we have to be careful about making Churchill into this, all-purpose hero for policymaking.
Because we don't want to be too aggressive in wars.
There's a time to be aggressive, and there's a time not to be aggressive. But the image of Churchill is to be aggressive all the time.
And he was misunderstood as being the saint, whereas Ulysses S. Grant is not recognized enough for the good things that he did. But who's someone that you want to understand more? Like if you could have dinner with some historical figure and ask them questions, who would it be?
Without a doubt, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. What would you ask him?
I would ask Lincoln. I would not ask him a single policy thing. Yeah. I would ask Lincoln, first of all, how did he learn to write the way he did? No president writes as well as Lincoln. I mean, Gettysburg Address, second inaugural. How did he learn to do it? He had like 2 years of schooling. How did he learn to do that? I'd talk to him about that. I would talk to him about how he came to believe in the Union in the way he did. For Lincoln, the Union was like his God. How did he come to that position? How did he learn to tell stories? I spent so much time reading about Lincoln, and you know what? He could win a debate with almost anyone, but he didn't debate. He told stories. He brought you to his side as a storyteller. And you know what? I'm fascinated, Jake, when I meet people like that. And maybe there's no one like Lincoln, but maybe those who come close, just to see how their mind works, how he interacts. I would give a lot to have a beer with Abraham Lincoln.
So you said you don't like, it's not debate, it's the storytelling that
Correct.
convinces people. What do you mean? If you describe a situation to someone, you win them over emotionally as opposed to just arguing with them on certain points, or
And you get them to change their thinking and give themselves credit rather than saying they lost a debate to you. It's very hard to get someone to change their views in an argument, even though we think that's what should happen, because people don't want to admit they were wrong and they hold fast to the position they're in. But if you tell someone a story and they think about the world differently, all of a sudden they see their argument differently. The classic example, right, is the grandparent who is, as most grandparents were, right, at least until recently, is very concerned that a gay grandchild will somehow, have an abnormal life and be strange and be immoral. But then as soon as they have a gay grandchild and they see the world through that grandchild's eyes, they love that grandchild and their views change. But it's not because someone wagged their finger and said, you have to be woke. You're not woke. It's not at all about that. It's that they've seen the world differently through that grandchild's eyes, who they love. A story can let you see the world differently through someone else's eyes.
and in that case, it's not someone telling someone a story; it's someone experiencing a story,
Yeah,
right?
that's the most important part. Yes, that's the Ulysses Grant thing, right? It's not that Grant gave up his racism and anti-Semitism because someone convinced him. It's because he experienced the war side by side with African American soldiers and Jewish soldiers who were as heroic as the white soldiers, and so he changed how he understood humanity.
How do we get people in society to take on to get to experience those types of like lived stories and transformations that he had?
We have to get people out of their bubble. We have to give them different experiences. I believe that we should have mandatory public service, not in the military. I don't think you should have to serve in the military, but I think you should have to do something in public service that's outside your community, outside your comfort zone. And you should have to spend a year of your time paid by the U.S. government, paid just a living wage, not getting rich on this. You can do it before college, after college, but you should have that kind of experience so you see the world differently. And I know this works because I've read all these oral histories of people who did this during the Great Depression, those who were involved in the Civilian Conservation Corps or the WPA. One of them was named Ronald Reagan, right? People who were involved in these activities during the Depression because they had to be, and the government was basically putting them to work. It changed the way they viewed themselves, their country, and those around them. That's not going to happen in a world of internet where people self-select, right, for those who agree with them and see the world. Podcasts like yours, which are wonderful, offer an opportunity for people to see a little bit differently, but it's just an introduction, right? It's just a taste. Getting someone into a new environment. And we can do that. We could do that, and it would be wonderful for our society.
Sounds like a big investment. I mean, having everyone spend a year in a whole.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Why not? Why not? I mean, and maybe they could even get some college credit for it, and so they could get through college faster. I'm okay with that too. But I see too many people, poor, rich, white, African American, Asian, whatever, who are in a lane and they only see the world in that lane, and that's our problem.
You have to get people to not just hear the other argument or see it, but to experience it, or to experience
Yeah.
another's viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, think about it in terms of our issues with crime, right? It's a hard issue. So there's no doubt that African Americans get treated differently by the police. But there's also no doubt that a lot of people have been in communities where they've been threatened and harmed by crime, right? And we need to understand both of you. It's not that you can't only see one side of that. And to say that is not enough. It's to help people try to experience. How do I try to think about this? I've talked a lot to friends of mine who are African American who have had run-ins with the police. And I've talked a lot. I grew up in New York City. I know a lot of people who had their houses broken into. I know people who were sexually harassed, right? And so I try as best I can to see the world through both sets of eyes. First of all, to show respect. But secondly, then when we're talking about that issue, you can't just think one side is right and one side is wrong. You've got to find the space with a legitimate fact pattern to find compromise.
Yeah, and like you said before, as long as people are forming their opinions rationally, like you can have different perspectives on
Totally.
the world. So you wrote the book, The Impossible Presidency. What are those impossible expectations that presidents have faced historically? And then do you think like that has changed since you wrote the book? How do you think the role of the president has evolved maybe
Yeah.
since you wrote the book?
Yeah, so the book is about how over time the job of the president becomes harder and harder. This is true of all leaders. The president is just a metaphor for all leaders in this, right? And we can study presidents closely. We can't study business leaders as closely. They don't give us their records. But what's happened is that people who are in charge of big organizations like a country or a university or a corporation, with every generation, they're called on to do more. They're expected. So presidents are expected now not only to help the country at home, but to be the leader of the free world, right? That was ridiculous to someone like Abraham Lincoln to say that, right? So you've got to lead the world, you've got to lead at home. You've got to micromanage programs. You've got to work with all kinds of different people. Then you've got to show up everywhere. I show in the book how much time presidents spend now, showing up somewhere. Team wins a national championship. They've got to spend time with that. You're supposed to be a cultural leader. You're supposed to be a literary figure. And now in the last few years, every word you say, someone has on video or recording, and it gets pulled apart. I mean, imagine, Jake, if everything you and I said during the day, someone was recording it and finding all the misspoken words or things we said, the times we got angry, and said something we shouldn't have said, and it never goes away, and then it's thrown in your face. It's impossible to do this job, and it gets worse. And I think since I've written that book, it's gotten even worse, because now it's not only that the information is out there, it's that there's so little trust that everything is always interpreted, no matter who it is, in the worst possible light. And so it means every day presidents spend their time fighting against all the negativity, which means they never get to their positive programming. We need to adjust our expectations. That's the argument in the book. We need to not expect so much. We need to elect people to do a few things and do them well. I don't want the president to be the person who tells me, what I should think about culture and a lot of stuff. I want a president who's able to protect our national security. I want a president who's able to keep our economy and contribute to our economy growing. I want a president who keeps the environment safe. A few things. And we can debate. I mean, my priorities might not be the majority priorities for the country. That's fine. But instead of trying to choose Superman, who has an answer to everything, we need to choose someone who can do a few things and do them well.
How do you think Trump will be remembered?
Well, I talk about him a little bit in the conclusion of that book. I finished that book just at the start of his presidency. I think he will be remembered sort of like Andrew Johnson, though I think Andrew Johnson was a far worse president. As a president, I'm sorry?
Well, no, I didn't. Why is that?
I think he'll be remembered like Andrew Johnson because he's one of the few presidents who tried to use the office not to enforce the law. He did not do the job. He never saw himself really as a president. He saw himself more as a king. What did he believe? He believed his job was to enrich himself and those around him and help his supporters. Whereas almost every president, whether Democrat or Republican before him, when they became president, they really believed they had to serve all the American people, or at least all of the recognized American people in the Constitution. So, presidents in the early 19th century didn't think they were serving the enslaved population. But post-1865, presidents generally, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, they believed, Ronald Reagan certainly, believed that it didn't matter. It didn't matter to Reagan whether you voted Democrat or Republican. He was president for all people, and he was going to enforce the law for all people. Trump never saw it that way.
And I see why you think he'll be remembered that way. And I think I probably agree with that, but half the country doesn't see him that way today. So why do you think that history will remember him that way when people who are experiencing him now firsthand don't even think that?
Well, because I think the historical view of presidents is often different from how they're seen. I actually think a lot of his supporters would agree with me. They'd say that he was helping them, and that's what mattered. And they would say other presidents didn't help them, that they were forgotten. that other presidents had forgotten them. And there is a bit of truth to that, right? There is a bit of truth to that. So I'm not even sure his supporters would disagree with what I say. They'd have a different definition of what the president is. I'm saying the president has to represent all Americans, whether you voted for him or not. Some would say no, it's good versus bad. The good people voted for him, and he only represents the good people. The other bad people, too bad.
Got it. So they might not even disagree with you. So my last question is, if you could distill, it's kind of a hard question. If you could distill one piece of advice for future generations, what would it be?
I think that I'm going to try to get 2 points into one here, right? That we should be very aware of strong ideologies that cover up and distort the facts. We should test our beliefs against facts and always rethink things. What makes American society and democracy so resilient and dynamic is we can always remake ourselves, and we have to keep remaking ourselves. We don't need to go back and find some precious stone that explains everything, a Rosetta Stone of democracy. No, that's antiquarianism. That's not history. History is about change over time. The strength of American society is we keep remaking ourselves by getting rid of ideology, looking at the issues with a fact-based set of interpretations, debating, and then trying something new. It's a constant experimentation. Franklin Roosevelt, who's the inspiration for my podcast, he said that every generation has to write a new chapter in the history of our democracy. And that's what we have to be willing to do. We have to have the courage to do that.
The courage and the humility to discard like what we used to think. Like you said, you've changed your viewpoint. You said there's strong ideologies that distort facts. So what's an example?
I'll take one on the left, because people probably think I'm criticizing the right too much. I do not like identity politics. I don't like those who believe that you have to look a certain way or have had a certain set of experiences to be right on an issue. And that's a kind of ideology of false authenticity and an ideology of identity. I don't believe that at all. I think you can reason your way. You can try to get close to understanding different points of view. And you don't have to be Jewish to really have legitimacy to talk about Jewish issues.
And by the way, because you said that you're thought of as criticizing the right more than the left, where do you stand politically? Like if you have to, I mean, maybe you don't want to bucket yourself into one or the other, but
I'll be honest. I'll be honest. I'm pretty eclectic, and as I said, usually when everyone agrees and I'm in a room, I disagree. I'm just that kind of person. But I identify with what I would call a kind of pragmatic progressive position, which is to say that I do believe that over time, it's the role of government and society to be more inclusive, to give more opportunity to more people. But I believe it has to be done pragmatically and fairly, and not to favor one group over another. So I love presidents, and people would know this from reading the Impossible Presidency and Civil War by Other Means. I love presidents like Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, both of whom were Republicans, but also Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Democrat. I see them, all three of them, despite their different parties, trying to move the country forward to give more people opportunity, but also doing that in a pragmatic and country-focused way, not specific groups.
Got it. So you see pros and cons on both sides.
I do, but yeah, and so that's where, and I mean, this sounds, kitschy, but I try to evaluate each issue on its own and each person on their own.
So who are you going to vote for?
In this election, I'm going to vote for Biden, because Biden actually believes in the Constitution and democracy, and I think this is an easy one, especially as a historian. Donald Trump does not believe in democracy, and we are a democracy. Now, there are Republicans I would vote for at many other levels, but in this case, I think, and I don't think Biden's perfect, by the way, but if it's a choice between a leader who believes in democracy and one who doesn't, I'm going to go with the leader who believes in democracy.
That's fair. So, Professor Jeremi Suri, thanks so much for all the time, for answering all my questions. I'm going to end the recording, and then maybe you and I could wrap up for a couple.
Yeah, minutes. Absolutely.